Anger makes us ignore the basic laws of physics. Today we break down 6 completely fatal neighbor disputes where revenge collided with brutal mechanical reality. This is a cautionary documentary, not an instruction manual. Never let rage override strict safety protocols. See what happens when ordinary people arrogantly push heavy engineering far beyond its breaking point. January 2008. A freezing morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood is about to violently intersect with the unforgiving laws of rotational physics. The temperature hovers at a bone-chilling 12 degrees. Arthur stands alone in his driveway. He is completely consumed by a bitter, long-standing dispute over property lines. He is not out here to clear his pavement. Instead, he is actively using a heavy-duty commercial snowblower as a piece of makeshift artillery. The machine features a thick red steel housing and a roaring 10-horsepower engine. Arthur actively gathers dense chunks of frozen ice and sharp driveway gravel. He feeds these abrasive piles directly into the spinning intake. He angles the plastic discharge chute perfectly across the property line. His explicit goal is to launch this icy shrapnel straight at his neighbor's living room windows. The snowblower, however, is an engineering marvel built exclusively to process soft, yielding snow. It is absolutely not designed to crush solid granite. A modern 2-stage snowblower operates using a simple, continuous drive mechanism. A highly tensioned, heavy rubber belt connects the active engine directly to a massive steel auger at the front. When the motor is running, the belt transfers massive torque. It spins the serrated metal blades at hundreds of revolutions per minute. If a solid, immovable object suddenly stops the blades, the engine does not inherently shut down. The heavy rubber belt just keeps on spinning. It slips wildly against the completely jammed metal pulley. This action creates immense physical friction and stores a lethal amount of mechanical tension. Arthur scoops up a massive clod of frozen dirt. It conceals a jagged piece of dense landscaping rock. He tosses the payload directly into the spinning metal maw. A violent, sickening metallic clank shatters the quiet morning air. The heavy steel blades stop instantly. They are violently wedged against the internal metal casing. The machine's engine immediately bogs down. It emits a deep, struggling mechanical groan. But the motor continues to run. This is the exact moment Arthur makes a fatal error in basic operational logic. The heavy metal blades have stopped moving. Because of this visual cue, his brain instantly categorizes the machine as entirely safe. He completely ignores the most critical rule of heavy equipment operation. He does not reach up to pull the ignition kill switch. The powerful engine is left running at maximum throttle. It is violently begging to release its trapped rotational energy. A thick cloud of blue exhaust, smoke mixes with the distinct smell of burning rubber. The drive belt screams internally against the lock pulley. Arthur stomps aggressively around to the front of the vibrating steel housing. He lifts his heavy, insulated winter work boot. He is blindly determined to force the machine back into compliance. He aims the thick rubber heel directly at the jamstone. He aggressively kicks downward, putting his entire body weight into the strike. The heavy boot impacts the frozen rock. For a fraction of a second, the stone resists the heavy blow. Then the friction hold suddenly shatters. The dense rock shifts exactly 1 inch and tumbles harmlessly out into the snow. In that exact microsecond, the physical universe violently reasserts its mechanical authority. The massive rotational tension of the drive belt is instantly unleashed. The thick rubber aggressively grips the metal pulley once again. All the stored kinetic energy from the 10-horsepower engine transfers to the primary shaft. The heavy steel auger accelerates to 300 revolutions per minute in less than a second. The sudden blur of motion is entirely invisible to the human eye. Before human nerves can even register the sharp mechanical snap, the spinning blades catch the fabric of Arthur's winter pants. The grip of the machine is mechanically absolute and entirely indifferent. The immense rotational torque forcefully pulls his lower extremity deep into the narrow steel housing. The sudden mechanical compression vastly exceeds the structural tolerance of human tissue and bone. He suffers catastrophic blunt force trauma to the lower limb. The severe physical compression causes critical vascular damage. Major arteries are severely compromised, initiating rapid and catastrophic vascular failure. His systemic blood pressure plummets in mere seconds. Hypovolemic shock immediately overwhelms his central nervous system. The profound physical trauma forces a rapid, absolute loss of consciousness. Within minutes, the severe lack of circulating oxygen leads to irreversible cardiac arrest. The bitter winter wind continues to sweep quietly across the pavement. The powerful engine of the red snowblower easily levels out. It returns to a smooth, perfect mechanical hum. It sits idling completely alone in the empty driveway. The sharp blades spin freely in the freezing air. It chews lightly through a fresh snowdrift. It tosses a harmless, elegant arc of soft white powder across the yard. The targeted glass of the neighbor's window remains perfectly intact. It reflects only the pale, cold morning light. November 2005. High above a quiet suburban property line, a massive galvanized steel water tank rests heavily atop 4 tall metal pillars. It is a freezing, pitch-black night. This imposing utility structure has become the absolute center of a bitter residential feud. The enormous metal cylinder was erected legally by a neighbor. However, its placement casts a permanent, cold shadow directly over David's once sunny backyard terrace. Consumed by a quiet fury over his lost sunlight, David has decided to bypass legal zoning disputes. He plans to directly alter the landscape through covert nocturnal sabotage. Armed with a heavy steel flashlight and long-handled socket wrenches, he steps into the freezing yard at 2 in the morning. His plan is simple, patient, and deeply flawed. He intends to silently remove the heavy securing bolts from just one of the primary load-bearing legs. His internal logic assumes that weakening a single support point is a safe bet. He hopes the next strong winter storm will eventually push the towering structure over. This would perfectly disguise his deliberate vandalism as a simple natural disaster. He completely fails to account for the unforgiving laws of fluid dynamics. A stationary elevated structure relies on perfectly distributed weight. When a container holds solid mass, like concrete or sand, the center of gravity remains completely static. Water, however, is a dynamic and highly responsive liquid load. 3,000 liters of water weigh precisely 3 metric tons. If a holding tank tilts even a fraction of an inch, thousands of pounds of liquid instantly rush toward the lowest point. This sudden shifting mass radically displaces the structure's center of gravity. It multiplies the downward pressure on the weakened side. It creates an absolute, unstoppable cascade of kinetic energy. Working quietly in the dark cold, David confidently attaches his heavy steel wrench to a thick, rusted bolt. He targets the bottom bracket, securing the front left support beam. He grips the cold metal handle and applies immense physical leverage. He feels completely insulated by a profound, misplaced sense of control. The heavy bolt groans softly in the quiet night air. He turns the wrench a quarter rotation, then a full half rotation. The steel nut finally breaks free from years of tension. He spins the loose fastener completely off the threaded steel shaft. He pulls the heavy metal pin entirely free from the base bracket. For an infinitesimal fraction of a second, the towering structure stands perfectly still. It balances entirely on the lingering friction of the surrounding metal joints. Then, the newly unsupported steel leg slips outward by exactly 1/8 of an inch. A sharp, echoing metallic ping rings out across the empty yard. It is a microscopic structural tilt, entirely invisible in the dark. But high above his head, deep inside the black cylinder, 3 tons of resting water instantly detect the subtle shift. A massive, silent wave of heavy liquid violently sloshes forward. It aggressively seeks the newly established low point. The immense, sudden transfer of kinetic weight violently displaces the tank's center of mass. It pushes the entire 3-ton load directly over the missing bolt. The extreme asymmetric force instantly overwhelms the structural shear limits of the remaining steel legs. The secondary support brackets snap simultaneously. They echo with the sharp, explosive sound of a gunshot. The heavy steel pillars immediately fold inward like crushed tin. Gravity violently asserts its absolute control over the massive object. 3 metric tons of water encased in heavy corrugated steel accelerate directly toward the ground. David barely has time to drop his silver wrench. The falling structural beams and the concentrated weight of the tank impact him with insurmountable kinetic force. He absorbs catastrophic blunt force trauma directly to the upper torso. The extreme mechanical compression causes a catastrophic structural trauma to the entire thoracic cavity. The sudden, overwhelming physical pressure completely compromises the structural integrity of his ribcage. This massive trauma immediately destroys lung function. It induces instantaneous respiratory failure. The massive systemic shock and sudden destruction of vital systems lead directly to immediate cardiac arrest. The deafening roar of twisting metal and crashing water echoes briefly across the houses. Then silence returns to the cold November night. The mangled remains of the heavy steel tank now rest completely flat against the ruined grass. A massive, muddy flood of cold water slowly seeps across the property line. It soaks quietly into the freezing winter earth. The scattered silver socket wrenches gleam softly under the pale moonlight. When the morning sun finally rises over the quiet neighborhood, its bright rays will completely flood the backyard terrace. It is now entirely unobstructed by the shadow of the tank. The architect of this newly cleared skyline, however, will never feel its warmth. August 2004. Mark sits alone in his dimly lit living room, completely exhausted by the constant heavy stomping from the neighbor upstairs. The stifling summer heat makes the cramped residential duplex feel even smaller, amplifying his bitter frustration. Banging a wooden broom handle on the ceiling is no longer enough for him. He firmly decides to wage total psychological warfare. He wants to make the upper floor completely uninhabitable. To achieve this, he buys 2 massive commercial concert speakers. He completely bypasses all standard home audio setup rules. He builds a custom wooden bracket. He uses it to screw the heavy speaker cabinets directly against his living room ceiling. He carefully points the huge 12-inch subwoofers straight upward. Mark thinks he is a genius. However, he completely misunderstands the true nature of his chosen weapon. He entirely ignores a critical and dangerous principle of acoustic physics. Sound is not simply abstract noise that you hear. It is a continuous series of invisible physical pressure waves. These waves travel aggressively through the air and punch into solid materials. Low-frequency bass waves are incredibly dense. They carry enormous amounts of unseen kinetic energy. They do not just create a loud volume. They create powerful, continuous physical vibrations that can violently shake solid structures. If a dense physical object perfectly matches the frequency of those invisible waves, it begins to shake violently along with them. Engineers call this destructive mechanical phenomenon acoustic resonance. Mark lies back comfortably on his heavy leather couch. He is positioned perfectly in the exact center of the room. He confidently reaches for the plastic stereo remote control. He turns the heavy electrical amplifier to its absolute maximum power output. He hits play on an intense, repeating heavy bass music track. The entire room instantly shakes with aggressive acoustic pressure. The glass windows rattle loudly in their wooden frames. He smiles broadly. He feels the deep, rhythmic vibration violently rattling his own rib cage. He assumes the worst possible consequence will be a frustrated noise complaint from the local police. But directly above his head, a totally unseen mechanical failure is rapidly unfolding. The high ceiling of this ancient building features a massive decorative plaster medallion. It was installed over 70 years ago. It weighs more than 50 kilograms. It physically anchors a heavy solid brass vintage chandelier. The antique ceiling plaster is incredibly dry. It is deeply compromised by decades of age and changing humidity. The old steel mounting screws hidden inside the ceiling are highly brittle. They are covered in a thick layer of rust. The continuous, intense bass frequencies from the speakers perfectly match the natural structural resonance of the ancient plaster fixture. The heavy, invisible vibrations act exactly like a relentless, high-speed mechanical hammer. For 10 continuous minutes, the massive acoustic energy violently shakes the fragile mounting hardware. Fine white dust begins to sift down from the ceiling. The antique plaster slowly cracks and degrades completely silently under the deafening noise. Mark simply closes his eyes. He is completely insulated by his own deep feeling of petty victory. Suddenly, the primary rusted steel anchor bolt snaps violently. It cannot handle the immense vibratory stress. The entire structural integrity of the ceiling fixture completely fails in a single fraction of a second. Over 50 kilograms of dense, brittle plaster and heavy solid brass immediately break free from the wooden ceiling joists. Gravity instantly asserts its absolute and unforgiving control over the massive object. The massive, jagged, heavy object plummets exactly 6 feet straight downward toward the leather couch. Mark has absolutely zero time to open his eyes. He has no time to react to the falling threat. The heavy brass base and thick plaster structure impact the subject directly on the upper cranium. The immense downward kinetic force causes catastrophic, non-survivable blunt force trauma to the human skull. The massive impact energy transfers violently and directly downward into the cervical spine. This extreme physical compression causes severe structural failure of the upper cervical vertebrae. The catastrophic neurological trauma instantly disrupts critical central nerve pathways. It causes an immediate permanent loss of physical consciousness. Total respiratory failure inevitably follows the violent impact within mere seconds. The profound structural trauma to the central nervous system leads directly to irreversible cardiac arrest. The heavy base continues to pound aggressively and rhythmically through the old wooden floorboards. Shattered pieces of thick white plaster lie scattered completely across the dark leather couch. The heavy brass chandelier rests silently on the living room floor amidst the pale debris. A thick cloud of century-old plaster dust hangs slowly in the vibrating air. The intense music vibrates heavily and continuously through the empty room. It entirely ignores the permanent silence of the man who deliberately turned it on. The ceiling above remains totally destroyed, leaving a gaping dark hole in the plaster. May 2011. A vintage, heavy-duty iron farm tractor idles loudly in a grassy backyard, smelling strongly of damp soil and unburned diesel fuel. Thomas stands aggressively beside the machine, deeply angry over a long-standing property line dispute. His neighbor placed a massive concrete surveyor's block to mark the contested boundary. Thomas stubbornly decides to fix the problem with brute force. He wants to forcefully rip this heavy marker directly out of the earth. He drives his vintage, heavy-duty iron farm tractor straight into the yard. Tractors are incredible machines built specifically to pull massively heavy loads. They generate extreme rotational force. Engineers call this rotational force torque. This immense power is localized entirely at the large rear wheels. To pull a heavy load safely, a standard tractor uses a thick steel drawbar. This crucial metal hitch is located extremely low to the ground. It sits carefully beneath the rear axle. This low attachment point is absolutely critical for safety. It keeps the front wheels of the heavy machine physically anchored downward during a tough pull. If you attach a heavy load too high on the tractor frame, you completely alter the fundamental physics. The rear axle suddenly becomes a deadly fixed pivot point. When the massive rear tires grip the dirt and the load refuses to move, the engine torque has nowhere else to go. Instead of moving the tractor safely forward, the extreme engine force violently rotates the entire front half of the tractor completely backward. It lifts the machine off the ground and flips it entirely over itself. Thomas completely ignores this basic principle of agricultural engineering. He simply does not want to crawl around in the wet mud. He refuses to bend down to reach the low, safe drawbar. Instead, he grabs a very thick, heavy steel towing chain from his garage. He tightly loops one end directly around the stubborn concrete block. He then hooks the opposite end of the chain to the upper top link bracket. This bracket sits high on the rear tractor frame. This improvised attachment point is a highly dangerous 3 feet above the safe drawbar. Thomas carelessly climbs up into the open, unprotected metal driver's seat. He pushes down the heavy iron clutch pedal with his leather boot. He forcefully drops the old mechanical transmission directly into the lowest, most powerful forward gear. He aggressively slams the metal hand throttle entirely forward to maximum power. The massive diesel engine roars loudly with raw, unrefined mechanical energy. Black smoke pours from the rusted exhaust pipe. He suddenly and sharply releases the heavy clutch pedal. The deeply treaded, massive rear rubber tires aggressively bite into the dry dirt. The thick steel towing chain instantly pulls entirely taut between the machine and the block. The heavy concrete block is deeply rooted in the compacted earth. It absolutely refuses to yield even a single inch. The immovable heavy load totally anchors the highly placed steel chain. The immense trapped mechanical torque of the roaring engine instantly transfers backward into the metal chassis. The heavy cast-iron front wheels of the tractor rapidly launch entirely off the solid ground. The entire 2-ton machine aggressively rotates straight upward. It pivots violently around the massive rear axle. The critical point of no return is crossed in less than 3/4 of a second. Thomas briefly realizes his fatal mechanical error, but the physics of gravity are absolute and entirely unforgiving. He desperately reaches down for the clutch pedal. It is already too late. The massive iron machine is actively flipping completely backward into the empty air. The heavy steel steering wheel and the solid cast iron engine block crush violently downward. The 2-ton agricultural machine impacts the human subject with truly insurmountable kinetic force. Thomas absorbs catastrophic, non-survivable blunt force trauma directly to the central thoracic cavity. The extreme, overwhelming mechanical compression completely compromises the structural integrity of his ribcage. The massive physical trauma instantly destroys all fundamental lung capacity. The heavy iron chassis causes severe, catastrophic systemic trauma to the primary vital systems. The sudden destruction of these critical biological systems forces immediate and irreversible cardiac arrest. Complete mechanical failure of the human body is absolutely instantaneous. A thick, brown cloud of dry dust slowly settles quietly over the disputed property line. The heavy green tractor now rests completely upside down in the ruined dirt. Its massive, deep-treaded rear wheels still spin lazily and quietly in the warm spring air. Black diesel fuel drips slowly from the inverted engine block. It soaks silently into the fresh spring soil. The heavy gray concrete boundary block remains perfectly anchored deeply in the ground. It is completely unmoved by the violent, fatal display of agricultural mechanical failure. May 1998. Richard stands completely alone in the dark, breathing heavily as he grips the cold plastic handle of a heavy gas chainsaw. The faint smell of wet grass mixes with raw gasoline as he stares fiercely at a massive oak tree. This towering wooden structure sits exactly on the property line. It casts a permanent shadow over his yard. Years of bitter neighborly arguments have solved nothing. His plan is simple and deeply reckless. He wants to cut the tree down across his neighbor's driveway. He hopes to cause maximum property damage while remaining unseen in the dark. However, Richard completely misunderstands the complex internal physics of living wood. He assumes cutting down a tree is like slicing through a dead concrete pillar. He completely fails to see the extreme physical danger towering high above his head. This specific oak tree has a heavy, pronounced lean. It is weighted entirely to one side by decades of uneven growth. A leaning tree is not an inert piece of wood. It is essentially a massively loaded biological spring. The heavy canopy at the top constantly pulls downward with thousands of pounds of gravitational force. This creates immense, invisible internal tension along the back of the trunk. Professional loggers know this specific hazard very well. They call the resulting catastrophic failure a barber chair. If you cut straight into a heavily leaning tree without proper safety cuts, the results are fatal. The extreme internal tension physically pulls the wood apart before the saw can finish. The trunk violently splits vertically right up the middle. The back half of the tree suddenly snaps completely free. It kicks backward and upward with explosive kinetic power. Richard is entirely unaware of this invisible threat. He sharply pulls the starter cord. The loud two-stroke engine screams into the quiet night. The sharp metal chain spins at 60 feet per second. He presses the roaring steel bar aggressively into the back of the trunk. He wants to finish the job quickly. He pushes hard against the solid, unyielding bark. Deep inside the wood, millions of fibers stretch to their absolute breaking point. He feels the heavy vibration of the engine in his hands. The sharp steel teeth chew rapidly through the outer layer. Wet wood chips fly blindly into the dark air. He ignores the subtle groaning sound coming from the upper branches. He cuts exactly 4 inches deep into the tension side. A terrifying, deafening crack suddenly drowns out the chainsaw engine. It sounds exactly like a heavy artillery shell detonating in the yard. The solid tree does not slowly lean forward as expected. It instantly explodes vertically. The immense gravitational weight of the canopy violently rips the trunk in half. A massive slab of solid oak breaks free from the stump. It weighs well over 1,000 pounds. It kicks directly backward at an incredible, blinding speed. Richard barely registers the loud snap. He has absolutely zero time to drop the running saw. He cannot step back into the safe darkness. The massive, jagged wooden slab impacts him directly on the upper torso. The immense blunt force trauma is absolutely insurmountable. The violent kinetic strike completely compromises the structural integrity of his thoracic cavity. The sheer impact energy massively compromises the human rib cage. It instantly destroys critical cardiopulmonary function. The secondary impact to the upper skull causes catastrophic neurological failure. Severe structural trauma to the central nervous system terminates vital brain functions. He experiences an immediate, permanent loss of physical consciousness. Total respiratory collapse and irreversible cardiac arrest follow in a fraction of a second. The heavy gas chainsaw tumbles away into the dark grass. Its hot engine stalls out in a sudden puff of blue smoke. The cool night air immediately falls completely silent once again. The massive oak tree remains heavily standing in the shadows. It is violently split exactly in half. A bright, jagged strip of pale yellow wood glows softly under the moonlight. It stands as a silent monument to a fatal misunderstanding of kinetic tension. August 2003. 14,000 volts of energized alternating current flow silently through thick municipal power lines suspended above a quiet suburban street. Just yards away, William climbs slowly up a rickety aluminum ladder onto a steep asphalt roof, completely exhausted and deeply enraged by a neighborhood dispute. The house right next door belongs to an amateur radio operator. A massive 30-foot aluminum antenna towers aggressively above the property line. For months, loud electronic static has bled directly into William's television speakers. The local authorities have repeatedly ignored his angry complaints. Tonight, he decides to forcefully dismantle the metal mast himself. He carries a heavy steel socket wrench in his pocket. He intends to unbolt the tower and throw it directly into the alley. However, William completely misunderstands the danger of leverage and uninsulated electrical currents. He creeps carefully across the slanted roof to reach the mounting bracket. Sweat drips down his face in the oppressive heat. He completely ignores the thick municipal power lines running perfectly parallel to the house. These suspended street wires carry over 14,000 volts of energized alternating current. They are not covered in thick protective rubber. They rely entirely on empty airspace to prevent the electricity from jumping to the ground. The tall radio antenna is constructed entirely from lightweight aluminum tubing. When properly secured to the roof, the heavy metal pole stands perfectly straight, but a 30-foot pole acts exactly like a giant mechanical lever. Once it leans even a few degrees, the weight at the very top multiplies exponentially. The physical force required to hold it upright becomes entirely impossible for one person. William reaches the base of the tall mass. He grips his heavy silver wrench tightly. His focus is entirely on the silver bolts. He does not look back at the deadly wires. He begins aggressively loosening the large retaining bolts. The humid night air is thick and completely still. He removes the first heavy fastener. The metal base bracket groans softly under the load. He moves quickly to the second bolt. He unscrews it completely and pulls the heavy pin out. He confidently wraps both of his bare hands around the cold aluminum base. He assumes he can easily lower the tall mast down to the shingles. In the exact moment the final bolt slides free, gravity violently takes over. The heavy 30-foot metal structure instantly tips sideways. The extreme mechanical leverage physically overwhelms his grip in a fraction of a second. The immense weight forcefully pulls him forward. He desperately tightens his hands around the aluminum base. He instinctively tries to catch the falling metal structure. This is a fatal error in basic electrical physics. He refuses to simply let go of the heavy pole. The long metal mast arcs gracefully through the dark summer air. It perfectly bridges the physical gap between the roof and the street. The top of the highly conductive aluminum pole strikes the uninsulated power line. The electrical connection is absolutely instantaneous. 14,000 volts of raw energy seek the fastest path to the ground. The heavy electrical current travels down the solid metal mast at the speed of light. It instantly enters William's heavily gripping bare hands. He becomes a direct, perfectly grounded human circuit. The catastrophic electrical force completely overrides his biological system. The extreme voltage causes massive thermal trauma to his internal soft tissues. The intense current violently disrupts the delicate electrical signals of his heart. He suffers immediate catastrophic ventricular fibrillation. His heart completely stops pumping blood. The immense electrical shock completely paralyzes his respiratory muscles. This induces instant absolute respiratory failure. The massive systemic trauma forces an immediate and totally irreversible cardiac arrest. Total loss of physical consciousness occurs exactly simultaneously with the electrical strike. A blinding flash of bright blue plasma lights up the entire street. A deafening explosive electrical crack echoes loudly across the neighborhood. A massive shower of bright orange sparks rains slowly down onto the dark asphalt. The local street transformer suddenly blows out with a heavy boom. The entire suburban block instantly plunges into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy aluminum mast rests silently against the high-voltage lines. It smokes softly in the hot, humid summer night. The bitter neighborhood noise dispute is quietly ended forever. 6 lives erased over fences, noise, and property lines. Let's hold court below. Who is the ultimate villain here? The unbearable neighbor who started the feud, or the victims whose blind rage caused their own fatal demise? Give me your brutal verdict in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel before your next bad decision.